The thunder cracked across the darkening Wyoming sky as Maribel Sinclair clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, her trembling fingers pulling the ragged blanket tighter around the child's tiny body. The howling wind tore at her mud-splattered dress as she stumbled forward, her eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of light emanating from a lone cabin nestled against the unforgiving landscape of the Bighorn Mountains. Wyoming Territory, 1875. The promise of a new life had brought Maribel west after the war, but the dream had quickly transformed into a nightmare. Now, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her precious baby, she was running from a past that threatened to consume her entirely. The rain pelted her face, washing away some of the caked mud but leaving trails of exhaustion in its wake. Her boots sank into the sodden earth with each desperate step, her lungs burning as she pushed herself toward what might be her last hope of salvation. The cabin door seemed miles away, though it stood only yards from her now. Maribel had heard stories of the reclusive rancher who lived in these parts, a man who kept to himself, who had carved out a small existence far from civilization. She had never intended to seek him out, had never planned on begging for shelter from a stranger, but circumstances had forced her hand. With the last of her strength, she stumbled onto the rough-hewn porch and raised her fist to the door, knocking with what little energy remained in her weary body. The baby whimpered softly against her chest, sensing her mother's desperation. The door swung open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man silhouetted against the warm glow of a fireplace. His eyes, sharp and alert, took in her bedraggled appearance, the mud that covered her face and dress, the exhaustion etched in every line of her body, and the small bundle clutched protectively in her arms. "Please," Maribel whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "My baby." "We have nowhere else to go." For a long moment he said nothing, and Maribel's heart sank. Then his expression softened imperceptibly, and he stepped aside. "You're home," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than he could possibly know. Hayes Morgan had long since grown accustomed to solitude. After returning from the war, he had deliberately sought the isolation of the Wyoming Territory, purchasing a small parcel of land where he could raise horses and cattle without the complications of society. The nightmares that had followed him from the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam had slowly begun to fade in the quiet of the mountains, replaced by the rhythmic patterns of ranch life. He had not expected visitors, certainly not on a night like this, with the storm raging across the valley. And he had definitely not expected a woman, mud-streaked and desperate, with an infant in her arms. As he closed the door against the fury of the storm, Hayes watched the woman sway slightly on her feet, her eyes darting around the cabin's interior as if assessing possible threats. The baby in her arms let out a small cry, and the woman immediately began to rock it gently, murmuring soft words of comfort. "Sit," Hayes said, gesturing toward the chair nearest the fire. "You need to warm up." She hesitated, clutching the child closer. "I won't hurt you," he added, his voice softening. "Either of you." Something in his tone must have reassured her, for she moved toward the chair, sinking into it with visible relief. The firelight illuminated her features more clearly now: high cheekbones, a determined chin, and beneath the mud, what he suspected was a complexion more used to sunlight than the pallor of fear. "My name is Hayes Morgan," he said, moving to put a kettle on the stove. "This is my ranch." "Maribel," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Maribel Sinclair, and this." She gently pulled back the edge of the blanket to reveal a tiny face with rosy cheeks. "Is Emma." Hayes nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he prepared 2 cups of coffee. The woman Maribel was watching him like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The baby had quieted, seemingly content in the warmth of the cabin. "How old?" he asked, nodding toward the child. 4 months, Maribel answered, some of the tension easing from her shoulders as she accepted the steaming cup he offered. "Thank you." Hayes settled into the chair opposite her, studying her with careful eyes. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question, and Maribel didn't treat it as one. She sipped the coffee, allowing the warmth to seep into her bones before responding. "Someone," she corrected quietly. "My late husband's brother, after Thomas died, he thought he had certain rights." Her eyes hardened, a flash of steel behind the exhaustion. "He was wrong." Hayes nodded, understanding more than she had said. He had seen enough of the world to know what men were capable of, especially men who believed themselves entitled to take what wasn't freely given. "Does he know where you are?" Hayes asked, already mentally calculating what preparations he might need to make if trouble followed her to his doorstep. Maribel shook her head. "I don't even know where I am. I've been traveling for days, staying off the main roads." She glanced down at Emma, her expression softening. "I just knew I had to get her somewhere safe." "You're about 15 miles from the nearest town," Hayes told her. "Clearwater. Small place, but they've got a general store, a telegraph office, sheriff's decent enough." Maribel's eyes clouded with worry. "I can't go into town. He has connections, friends in law enforcement back in Colorado, if word gets out that I'm here." Hayes considered this information carefully. "You can stay here tonight," he said finally. "Get some rest. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning." Relief washed over Maribel's face, followed quickly by suspicion. "Why would you help us? You don't know me." Hayes rose from his chair, moving to add another log to the fire. The flames leaped higher, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go," he said simply. "And I've never been one to turn away someone in need." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shower of raindrops against the glass. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a tentative peace had been established. "I'll make up the bed for you and the little one," Hayes said, moving toward a small alcove where his own bed was situated. "I'll take the chair tonight." "No, I couldn't. You need the rest more than I do," Hayes interrupted gently. "And so does she." Maribel wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was quickly claiming her. The warmth of the fire, the safety of the cabin, and the unexpected kindness of this stranger combined to lower her defenses. Emma had already fallen asleep in her arms, tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. "Thank you," Maribel whispered, unable to find more adequate words to express her gratitude. Hayes nodded, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Sinclair. You're safe here." As Maribel settled into the bed with Emma tucked securely beside her, she found herself believing him. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear. Hayes Morgan sat by the fire, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of the woman and child who had unexpectedly entered his life. He didn't know their story, not all of it, but he recognized the look in Maribel Sinclair's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in his own reflection for years after the war. The haunted gaze of someone who had seen too much, who had lost too much. Whatever had driven her to his door on this stormy night, Hayes knew one thing with certainty: he would not turn her away. Not tomorrow, not the next day. Not until she and her child had found the safety they so desperately sought. As the fire crackled and the rain continued to fall, Hayes settled deeper into his chair, prepared to stand watch through the night. Outside, the wilderness of Wyoming stretched vast and untamed, but inside his cabin, something unexpected had taken root, something that felt strangely like purpose. Dawn broke clear and bright, the storm having passed during the night. Hayes had dozed intermittently in the chair, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert to any unusual sounds. Now, as sunlight streamed through the windows, he moved quietly about the cabin, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. The baby woke first, her small sounds of hunger rousing Maribel from her exhausted slumber. Hayes kept his back turned, offering them privacy as Maribel tended to her daughter's needs, speaking in soft, soothing tones that carried across the small space. "There's fresh water in the basin," Hayes said without turning, "and I've put out some soap if you'd like to wash up." "Thank you," Maribel replied, and he could hear the gratitude in her voice. "For everything." Hayes nodded, continuing with his breakfast preparations. "Thought you might be hungry. It's nothing fancy, but it's filling." By the time he turned around, Maribel had cleaned the mud from her face and hands, revealing skin tanned by the sun and small freckles across the bridge of her nose. With her dark hair pulled back and her face washed clean, Hayes could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, though the weariness in her eyes spoke of experiences beyond her years. "You have a beautiful home," Maribel said as she settled at the table, Emma cradled securely in one arm. The compliment surprised Hayes. His cabin was functional but sparse, with few personal touches beyond the books stacked neatly on shelves and the rifle mounted above the door. "It suits my needs," he replied, placing a bowl before her. "Been here about 5 years now." Maribel accepted the food gratefully, her free hand managing the spoon with practiced efficiency as she kept Emma balanced against her. "You live here alone?" Hayes nodded. "Just me and the horses." "Got about 20 head of cattle too, but they mostly take care of themselves up in the north pasture." "It must get lonely," Maribel observed, then immediately looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me." Hayes shrugged, settling across from her with his own bowl. "I prefer quiet." "After the war, crowds didn't sit well with me anymore." Maribel's eyes flickered with understanding. "My husband was the same way after he came back. The noise, the people, it all seemed to overwhelm him." "Where did he serve?" Hayes asked, curiosity getting the better of him. "With the 8th Illinois Cavalry," Maribel replied, a sad smile touching her lips. "He was at Gettysburg and later with Sheridan in the Shenandoah." Hayes nodded, memories of his own service with the 2nd Colorado Volunteer Infantry rising unbidden. "Hard fighting, both places." "Yes," Maribel agreed softly. "He came back changed. We all did, I suppose." She glanced down at Emma, who had fallen back asleep after nursing. "Thomas never got to meet his daughter. He died before she was born, pneumonia, last winter." The simple statement carried the weight of months of grief, and Hayes found himself wanting to offer comfort but unsure how. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Maribel nodded, accepting his condolence with quiet dignity. "After he died, his brother Jeremiah took over the family business, a freight company in Denver. He offered to take care of us," she explained, her tone hardening at the memory. "But his idea of care was possessive. When I refused his advances, he became threatening." Hayes felt a familiar anger stirring within him, the same righteous indignation that had fueled him during the war when confronted with injustice. "And that's when you decided to leave?" "Not at first," Maribel admitted. "I tried to make it work, for Emma's sake. We needed the security, and the business had been partly Thomas's. But Jeremiah began drinking heavily, and his temper—" She trailed off, her free hand unconsciously rising to touch her cheek where, Hayes now noticed, the faintest yellowing of a bruise was visible beneath her sun-darkened skin. The night I left, he threatened to take Emma from me, said I was an unfit mother, that he'd have me declared incompetent. Maribel's voice trembled slightly. I packed what I could carry and slipped out while he was passed out drunk. We've been on the move ever since. Hayes pushed his empty bowl aside, his mind already working through the practicalities of the situation. Does he have the resources to track you this far? Maribel hesitated. The Sinclair Freight Company is one of the largest in Colorado now. Jeremiah has money, connections, and a temper that won't let him accept defeat. Then we need to be careful, Hayes concluded. Clearwater's small enough that strangers get noticed. Might be best if you stay here for a while, at least until we can figure out a more permanent solution. Maribel looked startled by the offer. I couldn't impose on you like that. We've already taken advantage of your kindness. It's not an imposition, Hayes said firmly. I've got the space and winter's still a few months off. Besides, he added, a faint smile crossing his face, it might be nice to have some company for a change, even if one of you doesn't talk much yet. As if on cue, Emma stirred in her mother's arms, tiny eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes as blue as the Wyoming sky. She blinked up at Hayes, her gaze curious and unafraid. She likes you, Maribel observed, surprised. She's usually wary of strangers. Hayes felt an unexpected warmth in his chest at the child's trusting gaze. Guess she knows she's safe here, he said quietly. Then, more practically, I need to check on the horses and make sure the storm didn't cause any damage. You're welcome to rest more if you need it. Maribel shook her head. I've imposed enough. If I'm staying, I'd like to help earn my keep somehow. Hayes considered protesting but recognized the pride in her stance. Fair enough. There's always work to be done on a ranch. He paused, then added, there's a trunk in the corner with some of my mother's old things. Might be something that fits you better than those travel-worn clothes. Maribel glanced down at her mud-stained dress, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I left in such a hurry. No need to explain, Hayes assured her. Take what you need. I'll be back in an hour or so. As Hayes stepped outside into the crisp morning air, he found himself contemplating the strange turn his solitary life had taken. A woman and a child responsibilities he had never sought, complications he had deliberately avoided since returning from the war. Yet there was something about Maribel Sinclair's quiet strength, about the determined way she protected her daughter, that resonated with him. For now, he would focus on the practical matters, ensuring his property was secure, checking for any signs that they had been followed, preparing for the possibility that trouble might find its way to his doorstep. The rest, the unfamiliar feelings stirring within him, those could wait. As Hayes made his way toward the corral where his horses nickered a greeting, he couldn't help glancing back at the cabin. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Maribel, Emma in her arms, moving about the space with cautious familiarity. "You're home," he had told her last night, the words coming unbidden to his lips. Now, in the clear light of day, Hayes wondered if perhaps those words held more truth than he had realized. The days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Maribel, determined to earn her keep, took over the domestic duties of the cabin with quiet efficiency. She proved adept at cooking, turning Hayes's simple provisions into meals that reminded him of his mother's cooking from long ago. Emma, for her part, seemed to thrive in the peaceful environment, her smiles becoming more frequent as the shadows of fear gradually faded from her mother's eyes. Hayes found himself adjusting his routines to accommodate his guests. He built a small cradle for Emma using wood from his stockpile, crafting it with a care that surprised even himself. The sight of Maribel's grateful tears when he presented it had stirred something long dormant within him, a desire to be the source of someone else's happiness. A week passed, then two. Hayes made a trip into Clearwater for supplies, returning with not only the essentials but also fabric for new clothes for Maribel and Emma, a rattle for the baby, and most precious of all, information. He had carefully inquired at the telegraph office whether there had been any messages asking about a woman and child traveling alone. The operator, an old friend named Daniel, had confirmed Hayes's suspicions. Someone in Denver was indeed looking for a young widow and her infant daughter. "How long before they trace her here?" Maribel asked that evening after Emma had been settled in her new cradle. The firelight cast a warm glow across her features, softening the worry lines that had begun to smooth out during her stay. Hayes considered the question carefully. "Hard to say. Daniel won't say anything he's trustworthy. But if this Jeremiah is as determined as you say, he might send men to check every settlement in the territory." Maribel's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Perhaps I should move on then. The longer I stay, the more danger I bring to your door." "No," Hayes said, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. He moderated his tone before continuing. "Winter's coming. The mountain passes will be treacherous soon, especially with a baby. Besides," he added, "you're safer here than on the road." What he didn't say was how the thought of her leaving had created a hollow feeling in his chest. In just 2 weeks, Maribel and Emma had transformed his solitary existence in ways he hadn't thought possible. The cabin felt like a home again, filled with the domestic sounds he had almost forgotten. The soft humming as Maribel worked, Emma's gurgling laughter, the gentle whisper of pages turning as Maribel read from one of his books in the evening. "I don't want to put you at risk," Maribel insisted, though he could see the relief in her eyes at not having to face the wilderness again so soon. "I can handle risk," Hayes assured her, unconsciously touching the scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from Glorietta Pass. "What I'm suggesting is that we prepare, not run. This is defensible land, good sight lines, limited approaches. If trouble comes, we'll see it coming." Maribel studied him, her gaze assessing. "You've thought about this a lot, haven't you?" Hayes nodded. "It's what kept me alive during the war. Planning, preparing, considering all possibilities." He hesitated, then added, "I won't let anything happen to you or Emma. You have my word on that." Something shifted in Maribel's expression, a softening, a trust that hadn't been there before. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk yourself for us? You barely know us." Hayes found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain what he himself didn't fully understand? The protective instinct that had surged within him from the moment she had appeared on his doorstep, mud-streaked and desperate. The way Emma's trusting gaze had awakened something he thought had died on the battlefields of the Civil War. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, falling back on the simple code that had guided him throughout his life. "And because—" He hesitated, unused to expressing such personal thoughts. "Because having you both here has made this place feel like a home again, not just somewhere I exist." The admission cost him something in pride, but the smile that bloomed across Maribel's face made it worthwhile. "Then we'll stay," she said simply, "and we'll face whatever comes together." Hayes nodded, relieved, and something more, something that felt dangerously like hope. "Together," he agreed. The following days were spent in preparation. Hayes showed Maribel how to use his spare revolver, patiently guiding her through the loading and firing process, until she could hit a tin can set up on a fence post with reasonable accuracy. They established protocols for what to do if strangers approached, creating hiding places and escape routes. Hayes reinforced the cabin's door and shutters, adding subtle fortifications while ensuring the place still looked like the simple dwelling of a solitary rancher. Throughout it all, a connection grew between them, tentative at first, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Hayes found himself watching Maribel when she wasn't looking, admiring the grace with which she moved, the gentle strength she displayed in caring for Emma, the intelligence that shone in her eyes when they discussed books in the evenings. For her part, Maribel began to see beyond the gruff exterior Hayes presented to the world. She noticed his tenderness with Emma, the way his calloused hands could be impossibly gentle when holding the baby. She observed his patient care for his animals, the quiet dignity with which he approached even the most mundane tasks. And she recognized in him a fundamental decency that had become rare in her experience since Thomas's death. As September gave way to October, the mountains began to don their autumn colors. The aspens turned golden, creating patches of brilliance against the deep green of the pines. The nights grew cooler, necessitating more wood for the fire and additional blankets on the beds for Hayes had insisted on building a small second bed for himself rather than continuing to sleep in the chair. It was on one such crisp autumn evening, with Emma already asleep in her cradle, that the boundaries between them shifted. They sat before the fire, Maribel mending one of Hayes's shirts while he whittled a small wooden horse, a toy for Emma when she was a bit older. "May I ask you something personal?" Maribel ventured, her needle pausing in its steady rhythm. Hayes looked up, a question in his eyes. "Of course. Why did you never marry? A man like you, kind, capable, with a good property, surely there must have been opportunities." The question caught Hayes off guard, though he had been half expecting it for some time. He set aside his carving, considering his answer carefully. "There was someone once," he admitted, his voice low. "Before the war. Sarah was her name. We had plans, talked about a future together." The memories were less painful now, dulled by time and distance. "When I came back from the fighting, I wasn't the same man who left. The things I'd seen, done." He shook his head. "Sarah tried, but she couldn't understand the silences, the nightmares. Eventually, she married a shopkeeper in Denver." "I'm sorry," Maribel said softly, genuine compassion in her voice. Hayes shrugged. "It was for the best. She deserved someone whole, not the broken pieces the war sent home." He glanced up, meeting Maribel's gaze. "After that, it seemed easier to be alone, simpler." "And now?" The question hung between them, fraught with meaning. Hayes held her gaze, allowing himself a rare moment of complete honesty. "Now I'm not so sure anymore." Maribel's breath caught, her needle forgotten in her lap. "Hayes." Whatever she might have said was interrupted by the sound that had become familiar to both of them, Emma's soft whimper as she began to wake. Maribel rose immediately, moving to tend to her daughter, the moment between them suspended but not broken. As Hayes watched her soothe the baby back to sleep, murmuring gentle words and rocking the cradle with a practiced hand, he realized with startling clarity that his feelings for Maribel had grown far beyond simple protection or duty. Somewhere in the quiet moments shared over meals, in the collaborative work of preparing for winter, in the evenings spent in comfortable conversation, he had begun to care for her in ways he had thought himself incapable of after the war. The realization should have frightened him, this vulnerability, this potential for loss. Instead, Hayes found himself filled with a cautious hope, a desire to explore these newfound feelings, to see where they might lead. When Maribel returned to her seat, Emma once again peacefully asleep, the air between them had changed, charged with unspoken possibilities. "She's growing so fast," Hayes observed, his voice deliberately casual. "Seems like she gets bigger every day." Maribel smiled, her eyes soft with maternal pride. "Yes, soon she'll be crawling and then walking. It happens in the blink of an eye, my mother used to say." "She's lucky to have you," Hayes said, the words coming from somewhere deep within him. "A mother so devoted, so brave." Maribel's cheeks colored at the compliment. I'm only doing what any mother would do to protect her child. No, Hayes disagreed gently. Not every mother would have had the courage to leave everything behind to face the wilderness alone with an infant. You're remarkable, Maribel Sinclair. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and in that moment, something shifted, a boundary crossed. A door opened. Hayes, Maribel began, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what the future holds for us, for Emma and me, but I want you to know that these weeks here with you have been. She struggled to find the words. They've been a gift I never expected to receive. Hayes set aside his carving knife and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were good hands, he thought, strong, capable, marked by the work of survival. He had watched these hands tend to Emma with infinite tenderness, had seen them grow confident around the handle of a revolver, had observed them transform simple ingredients into nourishing meals. Stay, he said simply, the word encompassing all he couldn't articulate. Not just until the danger passes. Stay after if you want to. Make a life here with me. Maribel's eyes widened, filling with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Are you certain? Taking us in temporarily is one thing, but permanently? I've never been more certain of anything, Hayes interrupted, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. These past weeks have shown me what I've been missing all these years, what this place should be. A home, not just a shelter. Tears gathered in Maribel's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. Emma needs a father, she whispered. Someone to guide her, protect her. And you? Hayes asked, his thumb gently brushing across her knuckles. What do you need, Maribel? She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing beyond the surface to the man beneath, the man he had been before the war, the man he might yet become. I need someone I can trust, she said softly. Someone honorable and kind. Someone who sees me as I am, not as a possession to be claimed. Her fingers tightened around his. I need you, Hayes Morgan, more than I ever thought possible after losing Thomas. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Hayes felt something tight in his chest release, a knot of loneliness and resignation that had been there so long he had stopped noticing its presence. May I kiss you? He asked, the question courteous but his voice rough with emotion. Maribel's answer was to lean forward, closing the distance between them. Her lips met his, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. It was a kiss of promise, of possibilities, of a future neither had dared to imagine. When they finally drew apart, Hayes rested his forehead against hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Whatever comes, he promised, we'll face it together. You and Emma are home now, and so am I. In the cradle near the fire, Emma slept peacefully, unaware that her world had just expanded, to include not only the mother who had risked everything to keep her safe, but also the man who had opened his door on a stormy night, and in doing so, had opened his heart as well. The golden days of autumn gave way to the first chill whispers of winter. Hayes and Maribel settled into a partnership that felt as natural as if they had known each other for years, rather than months. Their evenings together grew longer as daylight shortened, filled with conversations that ranged from lighthearted to profound, as they discovered the contours of each other's minds and hearts. Hayes found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, memories of his childhood in Missouri, of his parents who had died before the war, of his dreams for the ranch that had sustained him through the darkest days of combat. Maribel, in turn, spoke of her upbringing in Illinois, her courtship with Thomas, her fears and hopes for Emma's future. They were careful to maintain propriety despite their growing feelings. Hayes continued to sleep in his separate bed, though their goodnight kisses grew increasingly reluctant to end. Both were acutely aware of the eyes of the community, Though isolated, the ranch was still part of a territory where reputations mattered and gossip traveled fast. It was on a crisp November morning, with the first light dusting of snow on the distant peaks, that Hayes rode into Clearwater to post a letter to the county clerk, requesting information about marriage requirements in the territory. As he tied his horse outside the general store, intending to purchase a few special items for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday, he noticed 3 unfamiliar horses hitched at the saloon across the street. Nothing unusual in that, he thought initially. Travelers passed through Clearwater regularly, though less frequently as winter approached. Still, a prickle of unease traveled up his spine, the same instinct that had saved his life more than once during the war. Hayes entered the general store casually, nodding a greeting to Mrs. Patterson behind the counter. "Morning, Martha. Got any of those peppermint sticks left? Thought they might make a nice treat." Mrs. Patterson, a widow who had known Hayes since he first settled in the area, smiled warmly. "Just got a fresh supply in yesterday. I'll wrap up a dozen for you." She leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Heard you've got company out at your place these days. A young woman and a baby." Hayes kept his expression neutral, though internally he cursed the efficiency of frontier gossip. News travels fast. "Daniel mentioned you'd been buying extra supplies," Mrs. Patterson explained, "and Sheriff Collins spotted you with them last time you came to town." Her eyes were kind but curious. "She your kin?" Hayes considered his answer carefully. "She's important to me," he said finally. "That's all folks need to know for now." Mrs. Patterson nodded, respecting his privacy. "Well, you might want to know there are some men asking questions about a woman and child. Arrived this morning from Denver way. Said they're looking for a relative, a widow who's not quite right in the head, traveling with her baby. Worried about her safety, they claim." Hayes felt his blood run cold, though he maintained his calm exterior. "Is that so? They happen to mention a name, Sinclair, Mrs. Patterson replied, confirming his worst fears. "Said she might be using her maiden name, though, Mitchell or some such." "Appreciate the information," Hayes said, keeping his voice steady. "Think I'll take those peppermint sticks and whatever coffee you've got in stock. Might be a while before I make it back to town." As Mrs. Patterson gathered his purchases, Hayes's mind raced. He needed to get back to the ranch immediately, to warn Maribel, to prepare for what might be coming. But he also needed to know what they were facing, how many men, how well armed, how determined. After paying for his goods, Hayes made his way to the telegraph office, where Daniel greeted him with a concerned expression. "You heard?" Daniel asked without preamble. Hayes nodded. "3 of them." "3 that I've seen," Daniel confirmed. "Led by a fellow who calls himself Jeremiah Sinclair. Big man, expensive clothes, nasty eyes." Daniel lowered his voice. "Been flashing money around, offering rewards for information. Sheriff's keeping an eye on them, but they haven't done anything illegal yet." "They know about me?" Hayes asked directly. Daniel shook his head. "Don't think so. They've been asking general questions, whether anyone's seen a young woman with dark hair traveling with an infant." "Sheriff didn't mention your place specifically, just said there were several homesteads in the area where she might have sought shelter." Hayes felt a grim satisfaction at Collins's discretion. The sheriff was a good man who understood the value of minding one's own business. "I need to get back," he said. "If they start heading in my direction, I'll send Billy Tate out to warn you," Daniel promised, referring to his teenage assistant. "Boy can ride like the wind when he needs to." With a grateful nod, Hayes departed, forcing himself to move unhurriedly to his horse. As he mounted, he cast a careful glance toward the saloon. Through the window, he could make out 3 men at a table, one significantly better dressed than the others, with a gold watch chain visible across his vest. Jeremiah Sinclair, he presumed, come to reclaim what he viewed as his property. Hayes rode out of town at a measured pace, waiting until he was out of sight before urging his horse into a gallop. The familiar landscape flew by, autumn brown grasses and scattered pine groves blurring as he pushed his mount to its limits. His mind was focused on a single thought: getting to Maribel and Emma before Jeremiah Sinclair discovered their whereabouts. As he crested the final rise that overlooked his property, Hayes felt a surge of relief at the sight of smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Everything appeared normal, peaceful. He allowed his horse to slow to a trot as he approached, not wanting to alarm Maribel unnecessarily. She must have heard his arrival, for she stepped onto the porch as he dismounted. Emma balanced on her hip. The sight of them safe, waiting for him, caused a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the exertion of the ride. "You're back early," Maribel observed, her smile fading as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" Hayes secured his horse before answering, taking the time to organize his thoughts. "We need to talk," he said simply, following her into the cabin. Inside, he quickly explained what he had learned in town, watching as the color drained from Maribel's face. Emma, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss. "He's here," Maribel whispered, clutching Emma closer. "I knew he wouldn't give up, but I hoped." She closed her eyes briefly. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say," Hayes replied honestly. "They don't know you're here specifically, but there are only so many homesteads in the area. If they start checking them one by one—" "We need to leave," Maribel said immediately, her eyes darting around the cabin as if already mentally packing. "I won't bring this danger to your door, Hayes." "I can't." Hayes moved to her side, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Listen to me. Running now would be more dangerous than staying. The passes are already getting snow and they'll be watching the trails out of the valley. Here, we have shelter, supplies, defensible position." His voice softened. "And we have each other." Maribel looked up at him, fear and determination warring in her expression. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for us." "That's not what this is," Hayes insisted. "This is about standing our ground against a man who thinks he can take what isn't his. This is about protecting what matters." He cupped her face in his hands. "And you and Emma matter to me more than anything in this world." A tear slipped down Maribel's cheek. "I'm so afraid," she admitted. "Not for myself, but for Emma, for you." Hayes brushed the tear away with his thumb. "Fear keeps us alert, keeps us careful, but we can't let it rule us." He took a deep breath. "I have a plan, but I need you to trust me." "I do trust you," Maribel said without hesitation, "with my life, with Emma's life." The declaration humbled Hayes, reinforcing his determination to protect them both at any cost. "Then here's what we're going to do." Throughout the afternoon, they prepared. Hayes moved his most valuable horses to a hidden corral in a box canyon a mile from the main property, a precaution against both the approaching winter and potential intruders. He cached supplies in several locations, ensuring they would have access to necessities if forced to abandon the cabin temporarily. Most importantly, he and Maribel established clear protocols for various scenarios, including a final fallback position if all else failed. As darkness fell, Hayes checked and rechecked his weapons: the rifle that had accompanied him through the war, the revolver he wore on his hip, the shotgun mounted above the door. Maribel's own revolver was loaded and within easy reach, though both hoped it wouldn't be necessary. They ate a quiet dinner, the usual comfortable conversation replaced by a watchful silence. Emma, oblivious to the tension, played contentedly on a blanket near the fire, occasionally looking up to favor them with her gummy smile. "She's so innocent," Maribel murmured, watching her daughter grasp at a wooden spoon Hayes had given her to play with. "She deserves better than a life on the run." "And she'll have it," Hayes promised. "One way or another, we'll make sure of that." As they prepared for bed, the routine felt both familiar and strange, the normalcy of their actions underscored by the knowledge that danger approached. Hayes checked the doors and windows one final time before settling onto his bed, his revolver within easy reach. "Hayes." Maribel's voice came softly through the darkness. "If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Hayes interrupted firmly. "Please," Maribel insisted. "I need to say this. If anything happens to me, promise you'll take care of Emma. Don't let Jeremiah get her." Hayes sat up, able to make out Maribel's silhouette in the faint glow from the banked fire. "I promise," he said solemnly, "but it won't come to that. We'll face this together, and when it's over, we'll build that life we talked about." Silence fell between them, filled with unspoken fears and hopes. Then, to Hayes's surprise, he heard the soft rustle of Maribel rising from her bed. A moment later, she was beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Not when tomorrow is so uncertain." Hayes moved over, making room for her on the narrow bed. As she settled beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, he wrapped his arm around her, drawing her close. It was not passion that drove them together in that moment, but something deeper: the human need for connection in the face of danger, the comfort of knowing that whatever came, they would face it side by side. "Sleep," Hayes murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll keep watch." Maribel's breathing eventually evened out as she succumbed to exhaustion, but Hayes remained alert, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness beyond the cabin walls. Outside, an owl hooted, and the wind whispered through the pine trees, familiar, comforting sounds of the home he had built. As he held Maribel in his arms, Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Hayes made a silent vow. This was his family now, his to protect, his to cherish. And no man, certainly not one who viewed women and children as possessions, would take them from him. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass and a sharp bite to the air that promised snow before long. Hayes and Maribel moved through their morning routines with practiced efficiency, both alert for any sign of approaching visitors. It was just past noon when Hayes, chopping wood near the edge of the clearing, spotted movement on the ridge to the east. Shading his eyes against the sun, he made out 3 riders moving steadily toward the cabin. His jaw tightened as he recognized the distinctive silhouette of the lead rider, a large man on an expensive horse, exactly as Daniel had described Jeremiah Sinclair. Hayes set down his axe deliberately and walked unhurriedly to the cabin. Inside, Maribel was kneading bread dough, Emma napping in her cradle. "They're coming," he said simply. 3 riders from the east, about 15 minutes out." Maribel's hand stilled, flour dusting her forearms. "Jeremiah," Hayes nodded. "Looks like him, based on the description." 2 others with him, probably hired guns. Fear flickered across Maribel's face, quickly replaced by determination. "What do? We stick to the plan," Hayes replied, moving to retrieve his rifle from its place by the door. "You and Emma take position in the root cellar. I'll deal with our visitors." Maribel wiped her hands on her apron, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Be careful, Hayes. Jeremiah is unpredictable, dangerous when crossed." Hayes checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "So am I," he said quietly. As Maribel gathered Emma, still sleeping, and a few essential supplies, Hayes positioned himself on the porch, rifle resting casually across his knees. He wanted Sinclair to see him clearly, to understand that this homestead was defended, that whatever easy conquest he might have imagined would not materialize. The riders approached at a steady pace, following the rutted trail that led to the cabin. As they drew closer, Hayes could make out more details. Jeremiah Sinclair was indeed a large man, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with a thick mustache and expensive Eastern clothing that looked out of place in the rugged terrain. His companions were more typical frontier types, weathered, wary-eyed men with the hard look of those who made their living with guns. Hayes remained seated, outwardly relaxed but inwardly alert, as the three men reined in their horses about 20 yards from the porch. "Afternoon," Hayes called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Something I can help you gentlemen with." Jeremiah Sinclair studied him with cold eyes, taking in the cabin, the corral, the neatly stacked woodpile. "Perhaps," he replied, his voice cultured but with an underlying hardness. "I'm looking for someone, a young woman traveling with an infant. My sister-in-law, actually. She's unwell, left Denver in a state of confusion. The family's quite concerned." "Is that so?" Hayes responded, his tone neutral. "Haven't seen any woman with a baby pass through these parts." "Pretty isolated out here." Sinclair's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mind if we water our horses? Been a long ride from town." It was a transparent excuse to get closer to the cabin, to perhaps glimpse inside, but Hayes nodded agreeably. "Trough's over by the corral. Help yourselves." As the men dismounted and led their horses toward the water trough, Hayes remained on the porch, his rifle still across his knees. He could feel Sinclair's assessing gaze, searching for any sign that might confirm Maribel's presence. "Fine place you've got here," Sinclair commented, making a show of looking around. "Living alone, are you?" "Suits me," Hayes replied. "Town life never did agree with me after the war." "Ah, a fellow veteran," Sinclair observed, though Hayes noted he didn't claim similar service himself. "Which side, if you don't mind my asking?" "Union." "Second Colorado," Hayes said shortly. "You served?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Sinclair's face. "Business interests kept me occupied. Someone had to keep the supply lines running, after all." He cleared his throat. "About my sister-in-law, like I said," Hayes interrupted. "Haven't seen any woman with a baby. Though if she's family of yours, seems strange she'd run off without good reason." The implied challenge hung in the air between them. Sinclair's expression hardened, the pretense of civility wearing thin. "My brother's widow is confused, possibly dangerous to herself and her child. If you're harboring her out of some misguided sense of chivalry—" "I don't take kindly to being called a liar on my own property," Hayes interrupted, his voice level but with an edge of steel. "Now, your horses have had their water. I suggest you continue your search elsewhere." Sinclair stared at him, calculation evident in his gaze. His hand drifted casually toward his gun belt. "Perhaps we should have a look inside, just to be certain. For the woman's safety, you understand." Hayes stood slowly, his rifle now held ready but not quite aimed. "That won't be necessary." "This is private property, Mr. Sinclair. You and your men need to move on." "You know my name," Sinclair observed, his voice dangerously soft. "Interesting, since I don't recall introducing myself." Hayes cursed his slip mentally but kept his expression impassive. "Small town. Word gets around when strangers start asking questions." For a tense moment, the two men regarded each other, the air between them charged with potential violence. Hayes was acutely aware of the other two men flanking Sinclair, their hands hovering near their weapons. 3 against 1 weren't odds he favored, but he had position and the rightness of his cause on his side. Finally, Sinclair smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Well, we won't take up any more of your time, for now." He turned to his men. "Mount up. We have other places to check." As they prepared to depart, Sinclair paused, looking back at Hayes with undisguised malice. "If you do happen to see my sister-in-law, tell her Jeremiah sends his regards, and that I'll be seeing her soon." Hayes watched them ride away, maintaining his vigilant stance until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow himself to exhale slowly, the tension in his muscles easing slightly. He waited another 10 minutes before moving to the root cellar entrance, concealed behind a false wall in the pantry. "They're gone," he called softly, sliding the panel aside. Maribel emerged. Emma clutched to her chest, her face pale but composed. "They'll be back," she said, not a question but a certainty. Hayes nodded grimly. "Yes, Sinclair knows you're here, or at least strongly suspects it. My guess is they'll return after dark, thinking to catch us unprepared. What do we do?" Maribel asked, following Hayes back into the main room of the cabin. Hayes checked the position of the sun, perhaps 3 hours of daylight remaining. "We prepare," he said simply. "And then we turn the tables on Mr. Jeremiah Sinclair." Throughout the afternoon, they worked methodically. Hayes moved several strategic pieces of furniture to create defensive positions within the cabin. He cleaned and checked all weapons one final time, placing them where they could be quickly accessed. Outside, he set up subtle trip lines that would alert them to approaching intruders in the darkness. Maribel, for her part, prepared food that could be eaten cold if necessary and organized essential supplies for Emma. She moved with a controlled precision that spoke of her determination to protect her child at all costs. As dusk approached, Hayes built up the fire to create the illusion of a normal evening routine. Lanterns were lit and placed to cast shadows on the curtains that would suggest occupants moving about inside. Then, as full darkness fell, Hayes and Maribel enacted the next phase of their plan. Bundling Emma warmly against the night chill, they slipped out the back of the cabin and made their way to a hunting blind Hayes had constructed the previous winter, a small, concealed shelter with a clear view of the cabin and its approaches. There they settled in to wait, the night silence broken only by Emma's occasional soft sounds and the distant cry of a coyote. "How long?" Maribel whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "If they're smart, they'll wait until full dark," Hayes replied softly. "Midnight, perhaps." "If they're impatient." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood that what happened next depended entirely on Jeremiah Sinclair's next move. The hours crept by, marked by the slow wheeling of stars overhead and the gradual dimming of the lanterns in the cabin as their oil supplies dwindled. Emma slept peacefully in Maribel's arms, wrapped in blankets against the increasing cold. It was just past midnight when Hayes tensed, his hand moving to touch Maribel's arm in silent warning. In the silver moonlight, 3 dark figures could be seen approaching the cabin, not from the main trail this time, but from the west, using the tree line for cover. "They're trying to be clever," Hayes murmured, his eyes tracking their movement. "Coming from downwind so the horses won't smell them." Maribel shifted slightly, her free hand moving to the revolver in her pocket. "What now?" "We wait," Hayes replied, his voice barely audible. "Let them show their true intentions." The 3 men moved with exaggerated caution toward the cabin, pausing frequently to listen. When they reached the edge of the clearing, they separated, one circling toward the back door, the others approaching the front. Even at this distance, Hayes could recognize Jeremiah Sinclair's bulky silhouette in the moonlight. "They're surrounding the cabin," Maribel whispered, alarm edging her voice. Hayes nodded grimly. No pretense of a social call this time. They watched as the men converged on the cabin. The one at the rear tried the door, found it locked, then moved to peer through a window. At the front, Sinclair and his other companion conferred briefly before Sinclair stepped boldly onto the porch and pounded on the door. Maribel. His voice carried clearly through the night air. I know you're in there. Come out now and we can discuss this reasonably. No response came from the cabin, of course. After a moment, Sinclair pounded again harder. This is your last chance, he called. Think of the child, Maribel. You can't raise her properly out here in the wilderness with some mountain man. When silence continued to be the only answer, Sinclair's demeanor changed visibly. He stepped back, nodding to his companion, who produced something from his coat, a small flask that he proceeded to splash against the cabin wall. Coal oil, Hayes breathed, a cold fury building within him. They're going to try to smoke you out or worse. Maribel clutched Emma closer, horror in her eyes. They'd burned down the cabin with us inside. They don't know about the root cellar, Hayes reminded her. They think you'd have to come out. He checked his rifle, his decision made. Stay here with Emma. If anything happens to me, take her and head for the Box Canyon. There are supplies enough to last until you can safely make it to Sheriff Collins in Clearwater. Hayes, no, Maribel began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. I won't let them destroy our home, he said quietly, or threaten our future. Before she could protest further, Hayes slipped out of the blind and moved swiftly through the darkness, using the terrain and his intimate knowledge of the property to circle behind the men. By the time he had positioned himself, Sinclair had produced a match and was preparing to light the oil-soaked wood. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sinclair, Hayes called, his rifle trained steadily on the larger man. All three men whirled toward his voice, hands moving to their weapons. Hayes's rifle barked once, sending Sinclair's match flying from his fingers. Next one won't be a warning, Hayes said calmly, already having worked the lever to chamber another round. Drop your guns, all of you. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Sinclair laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the night silence. You're outnumbered, Morgan. 1 against 3 aren't odds I'd take. 2 against 3, came Maribel's clear voice as she stepped from the shadows, her revolver steady in her hand. She had left Emma safely concealed in the blind, Hayes realized, admiring her courage even as he worried for her safety. Sinclair's eyes widened as he spotted Maribel. There you are, my dear sister-in-law. We've been so worried about you. Save your lies, Jeremiah, Maribel replied, her voice cold. You never cared for me or for Emma. You only wanted what was Thomas's, including his wife. Sinclair's expression hardened. You're being hysterical, as usual. The grief has clearly affected your mind. I'm simply here to bring you and my niece home where you belong. This is my home now, Maribel said firmly. With Hayes, and Emma is safe here, loved here. We're not going anywhere with you. Sinclair's facade of concern dropped away, replaced by naked anger. You ungrateful bitch. After everything I've done, everything you've done, Maribel interrupted, her voice rising. You mean like trying to force yourself on me after my husband's funeral, or threatening to have me declared insane so you could take my child? Or perhaps you mean tracking us across half the territory like animals. Hayes kept his rifle trained on Sinclair, noting with grim satisfaction the shock on the faces of his companions. Clearly, they hadn't been informed of the true nature of their employer's family concern. She's lying, Sinclair said quickly. The grief, the stress of losing Thomas, it's affected her mind. I don't think so, Hayes replied steadily. Now drop your weapons, all of you. Sheriff Collins will sort this out. One of Sinclair's men, the younger of the two, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Sinclair, you said this was just about bringing your brother's widow home safe. You didn't say nothing about burning cabins or— Shut up, you fool, Sinclair snapped. His hand moved suddenly toward his holster. I'm not leaving without what's mine." Several things happened at once. Hayes fired, his bullet catching Sinclair in the shoulder, spinning the larger man around. The younger hired gun threw down his weapon and backed away, hands raised. The third man drew and fired wildly, his bullet splintering wood on the cabin wall near Hayes's head. Maribel's revolver cracked once, twice. The third gunman staggered, clutching his arm, his weapon falling to the ground. Sinclair, despite his wound, lunged toward Maribel with a roar of rage. Hayes dropped his rifle and tackled the larger man, driving him to the ground with enough force to expel the air from his lungs. They grappled in the dirt, Sinclair's greater bulk giving him an advantage that was countered by Hayes's combat experience and righteous fury. Punches were exchanged, each man seeking leverage over the other. Hayes felt his lips split from a powerful blow, tasted blood in his mouth. In the periphery of his vision, he could see Maribel keeping the wounded gunman covered, while the younger man remained frozen, hands still raised in surrender. Sinclair landed another heavy blow to Hayes's ribs, momentarily driving the breath from his body. Using the pain to fuel his determination, Hayes broke Sinclair's grip and delivered a punishing strike to the man's wounded shoulder. Sinclair howled in agony, his attack faltering. Hayes pressed his advantage, forcing the larger man onto his back and pinning him with a forearm across his throat. "It's over, Sinclair," Hayes growled, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult but not impossible. "You've lost." "She's my brother's widow," Sinclair gasped, still struggling despite his predicament. "The child is my blood. You have no right. Maribel and Emma aren't property," Hayes interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "They're people who have made their choice, and that choice isn't you." For a moment, something like genuine confusion crossed Sinclair's face, the bewilderment of a man who had never considered that what he wanted might be secondary to what others chose. Then his expression hardened again into bitter hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat. "Both of you." "I have friends in Denver. Connections." "So do I," came a new voice from the edge of the clearing. Sheriff Collins rode forward, flanked by two deputies, their approach having gone unnoticed in the heat of the confrontation. Including a judge who takes a very dim view of arson and attempted kidnapping. Relief washed through Hayes as he maintained his hold on Sinclair. Daniel must have followed through on his promise to alert the sheriff if Sinclair and his men left town with obvious ill intent. "This is a private matter, Sheriff," Sinclair protested, struggling against Hayes's grip. "A family dispute." "Is that so?" Collins dismounted, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. The oil splashed on the cabin wall, the discarded weapons, the wounded gunman being tended reluctantly by his younger companion. "Seems to me attempting to burn down a man's home goes beyond a family dispute." He turned to Maribel, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Sinclair, I presume?" Maribel nodded, lowering her revolver now that help had arrived. "Yes, though I'd prefer to be known as Mrs. Morgan before long if Hayes is still willing." Her words sent a surge of emotion through Hayes, momentarily distracting him from his hold on Sinclair. The larger man sensed the opportunity and bucked violently, nearly breaking free. Hayes recovered quickly, applying more pressure to Sinclair's throat until the man subsided, gasping. "Oh, I'm still willing," Hayes assured her, a smile breaking through despite the situation. "More than willing." Sheriff Collins cleared his throat, though a hint of amusement softened his stern demeanor. "Well, that's a matter for you two to settle once we've dealt with the current situation." He gestured to his deputies, who moved forward to take custody of Sinclair and his men. "Mr. Sinclair, you and your associates will be coming with us to Clearwater to answer some serious charges." As the deputies secured the prisoners, Collins turned back to Hayes and Maribel. "I'll need statements from both of you, but that can wait until tomorrow. For now, see to your injuries and—" He paused, noticing Maribel's worried glance toward the hunting blind where Emma remained hidden, "and your family." Once the sheriff and his prisoners had departed, the sudden silence seemed to emphasize the magnitude of what had just transpired. Hayes and Maribel stood together in the moonlight, the cabin their home still standing solid behind them. "I need to get Emma," Maribel said softly, touching Hayes's bruised face with gentle fingers before moving toward the blind. Hayes watched her go, feeling the various aches and pains from the fight beginning to assert themselves now that the danger had passed. His split lip throbbed, and he suspected at least one rib was cracked. But these physical discomforts seemed trivial compared to the overwhelming relief that Maribel and Emma were safe, that the threat Sinclair posed had been neutralized. When Maribel returned with Emma, still miraculously asleep despite the commotion, Hayes felt something settle within him, a certainty, a rightness that transcended the chaos of the night. "Did you mean it?" he asked as they made their way back to the cabin together. "About becoming Mrs. Morgan?" Maribel looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the moonlight and something more, a steadfast love that humbled him. "With all my heart," she replied, "if you'll have us." Hayes stopped, turning to face her fully. Despite his injuries, despite the lingering tension of the confrontation, he couldn't help but smile. "Maribel Sinclair, I've been wanting to make you my wife since the moment you started making this place feel like a real home." He glanced down at Emma, peaceful in her mother's arms. "Both of you." Maribel's answering smile was radiant, even in the dim light. "Then ask me properly, Hayes Morgan." Hayes took her free hand in his, mindful of Emma between them. "Maribel, will you marry me? Be my wife, let me be Emma's father, build a life here together." "Yes," Maribel whispered, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Yes to all of it." Their kiss was gentle, mindful of Hayes's split lip, but filled with promise, the promise of mornings and evenings together, of watching Emma grow, of building something lasting and true in this wild, beautiful country they both loved. As they entered the cabin together, Hayes felt a profound sense of coming home, not to the physical structure itself, but to the family that now inhabited it. The words he had spoken on that stormy night months ago echoed in his mind, carrying new meaning, new depth. "Your home." And they were all of them together. Spring came to the mountains in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong. The harsh Wyoming winter had gradually released its grip, giving way to lengthening days and the promise of renewal. For Hayes and Maribel Morgan, this particular spring carried special significance, their first as husband and wife. They had married in December, a small ceremony in the Clearwater Church with Sheriff Collins and Daniel as witnesses. Jeremiah Sinclair and his men had been transported to Denver to face justice, their trial resulting in significant prison sentences that ensured they would pose no further threat to the Morgan family. Now, as April sunshine warmed the land, Hayes stood on the porch of the cabin expanded over the winter to include a proper bedroom for himself and Maribel, with another small room for Emma. His gaze followed his wife as she moved among the newly planted garden beds, Emma toddling beside her on increasingly steady legs. At 10 months old, Emma was growing into a confident, curious child with her mother's dark hair, and what Hayes liked to think was his own determined temperament. She had said her first word, "da," just after Christmas, and Hayes had felt his heart might burst with pride and love. "She's trying to eat dirt again," Hayes called, amusement coloring his voice as he observed Emma's latest exploration. Maribel turned, laughing as she gently extracted a handful of soil from her daughter's determined grip. "I swear she's part goat," Everything goes straight to her mouth these days. Hayes descended the porch steps to join them, scooping Emma up and settling her on his hip with practiced ease. "That's my girl," he said, brushing dirt from her chubby fingers. "Always wanting to taste life." Maribel leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm as she had since that first night they had held each other for comfort. "She gets that from you, I think. That curiosity, that boldness." "And your beauty," Hayes added, pressing a kiss to his wife's forehead. "Lucky girl, that." Their contentment was hard-won, all the more precious for the trials they had overcome to achieve it. The winter had brought its challenges: heavy snows, bitter cold, the occasional lingering nightmare from their respective pasts, but they had faced each obstacle together, growing stronger as a family with each passing day. Sheriff Collins rode by earlier, Maribel mentioned as they walked together toward the newly expanded corral where Hayes's prized horses grazed. He brought news from Denver. Hayes raised an eyebrow, adjusting Emma's weight on his hip. "Good or bad?" "Good," Maribel assured him. "Jeremiah's appeal was denied. He'll serve his full sentence." She hesitated, then added, "And the judge ruled on Thomas's estate. As his widow, I'm entitled to a portion of the freight company's assets, enough to ensure Emma will have a proper education when the time comes." Hayes nodded, satisfied that justice had prevailed. "Your husband would have wanted that," he said gently, having long since learned that Maribel's love for him didn't diminish the place Thomas Sinclair held in her heart. "He'd be proud of how you've protected her, how strong you've been." Maribel's eyes softened with gratitude for his understanding. "I think he would approve of you, too," she said, reaching up to touch Hayes's face, the scar along his jawline that she now knew every contour of, the strong lines that had softened slightly with happiness over the past months. "Of the father you've become to Emma, the husband you are to me." Hayes kissed her then, a tender affirmation of all they had built together. Emma squirmed between them, demanding attention in her increasingly vocal way. "Pa," she exclaimed, patting Hayes's cheek with sticky fingers. "Pa down." "Always giving orders, this one," Hayes chuckled, setting her carefully on her feet and watching as she immediately began to explore the grass around them, occasionally looking back to ensure her parents were still nearby. "She knows what she wants," Maribel observed proudly, "just like her mother." "And what does her mother want?" Hayes asked, drawing Maribel closer, his hands settling at her waist with familiar intimacy. Maribel's smile turned mischievous, her eyes bright with joy and something more, a secret she had been waiting for the right moment to share. "Well," she began, guiding one of his hands to rest against her stomach, "I was thinking perhaps Emma might like a brother or sister come winter." For a moment, Hayes simply stared at her, processing her words. Then a grin spread across his face, transforming his usually solemn features into boyish delight. "Truly," he whispered, his hand pressing gently against her still flat abdomen. Maribel nodded, her own happiness reflected in her eyes. "Truly, I'm certain of it." Hayes let out a whoop of joy, lifting Maribel and spinning her in a circle before setting her carefully back on her feet, mindful of her condition. Emma looked up at the commotion, giggling at her parents' display. "Another baby," Hayes marveled, his voice thick with emotion. "Another piece of us in the world. Are you happy?" Maribel asked, though the answer was written plainly across his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Hayes replied, drawing her close again. "When you knocked on my door that night, with mud on your face and Emma in your arms, I had no idea you were bringing me the life I never knew I wanted, never knew I needed." Maribel rested her head against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. "And when you said you're home, I didn't realize how true those words would become, how much this place, this life with you would come to mean." As the spring sun warmed the earth around them, Hayes Morgan held his family close, marveling at the journey that had brought them together. From the darkness of war and loss, through danger and uncertainty, to this moment of perfect contentment, it was more than he had ever dared to hope for, more than he had believed possible in the aftermath of battle. "I love you," he murmured against Maribel's hair, the words simple but carrying the weight of all he felt for her. "Both of you, all of you," he amended, his hand once again finding its way to her stomach where their second child grew. "And we love you," Maribel replied, her voice steady with the certainty of absolute truth. "Always." Emma toddled back to them, arms raised in the universal signal of a child wanting to be lifted. Hayes complied, raising her high above his head before settling her against his shoulder. Together, the three of them soon to be four turned toward the cabin that had become so much more than shelter. It was, as Hayes had said on that stormy night so many months ago, home. Not just for Maribel and Emma, who had arrived desperate and afraid, but for Hayes himself, who had finally found in their love the peace that had eluded him since the war. As they walked hand in hand toward the future they would build together, the wilderness of Wyoming stretched out around them, vast, challenging, beautiful, and full of possibility. Just like love itself.